The chandelier swayed, though no wind touched the room. Daniel's voice cracked as he whispered, "You weren't supposed to see this." Marcus froze, the silver watch glinting in his trembling hand. From the corner, Thomas's eyes narrowed, calculating, silent. Somewhere down the hall, a door slammed like a verdict. And in that instant, the truth began to bleed through the lies. Before diving into this gripping tale, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to catch more inspiring stories like this one. The boarding pass trembled in Marcus Bennett's hand like a small, private secret. Outside, the airport sky was a flat sheet of gray, the kind of light that washed colors down to bone. Inside, the terminal smelled of coffee and vinyl and the faint, sweet anxiety that gathers around people who are about to leave something behind. He stood by a tall window and watched a plane breathe, engines sighing, chimes blinking, while the city he had left the night before moved slowly beneath the cloud line, indifferent and bright. Marcus was 28 and very careful about how he filled the silence. He had learned to count the beats between his heart and the world long before he could afford the things that used to crowd his thoughts. Wealth had given him rooms that never saw dust, but it had not given him the simple mercy of being understood. Tonight, he wore a charcoal coat, a plain white shirt, and a watch that caught the light in a way that suggested modesty rather than flash. He liked that about it. He liked that people could look and misread him. It kept them from asking what he did not want to answer. He folded the boarding pass over and over until the ink softened under his thumb. The pass said his name and a seat number, row 12, an aisle seat, which he had chosen because on long flights he preferred the illusion of control. He liked the idea of standing up easily, of moving when he wanted. Sitting still made his thoughts dangerous. Motion kept them at bay. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve nearby, asking about the clouds. Marcus watched them, the small family on a warm, untidy island in the sea of people. He felt both invited and excluded, a feeling that had followed him since he was too young to know the weight of it. People loved him and judged him with the same breath. They praised his work and whispered that luck had played a part. They admired his calm and only sometimes asked, without much hope, what it cost him to be that calm. He remembered the last message he had received before the trip, a line of text from someone named Daniel, short, exact, like one of Daniel's old emails. Do not let them get comfortable. Come home with answers. There had been no smiley, no lightness. Daniel's words sat in Marcus's pocket like a coin with sharp edges. Daniel was his oldest friend, the man who had mapped out company anniversaries and family dinners and the long nights when Marcus had doubted his own right to the name he carried. Daniel did not let him be soft. That was part of why Marcus trusted him. The terminal lights hummed, and somewhere a gate agent announced boarding, a soft, distant voice that folded neatly into the white noise. People began to move, pieces sliding into place. A mother adjusting a stroller, a man in a suit pressing his ear to a headset, a woman with paint-splattered fingers lugging a canvas tube. Marcus tightened his grip on the boarding pass. The city below seemed to be made of the same brittle glass as his confidence, beautiful and fragile. He thought, briefly and with a sting, about the article that had run last month, a profile that called him a wunderkind and an outsider, all in the same breath. The profile had tried to fit him into neat boxes: philanthropist, tech founder, anomaly. Marcus had read it in a hotel room, windows open to a rain that smelled like the sea, and had felt both exposed and amused. Words were only a map. They could not point to the place where the mapmaker kept his wounds. At the gate, he moved with a polite detachment, nodding to acquaintances, smiling in the language of people who had learned to mean little and be understood. A woman he had met at an investor dinner a week ago recognized him and came over, her perfume a soft cedar. They traded small talk about flights and weather. She did not look at his hands. Marcus liked that, too. Sometimes anonymity felt like air. When the line slowed, Marcus felt the small surge of relief that comes before being sealed into a temporary, shared fate. He had always liked planes because they announced, in mechanical terms, the possibility of something new. Landings and takeoffs were decisions you could briefly watch with your eyes open. He pictured absurdly his childhood self crouched on a rooftop in his old neighborhood. No money, no title, but wide with possibility. The boy liked the whole sky then. As he handed his pass to the gate attendant, a man behind him coughed a dry, practiced sound. Marcus noticed him because the man's hands were pale and careful, like someone unused to taking up space. He wore a sweater that had been chosen with thought, a soft gray with a small fray at the cuff. There was a watch on his wrist, cheap but neat, and a small, battered briefcase at his feet. He seemed, at a glance, ordinary in a way that made him easy to ignore. Marcus slid into his seat when the time came, feeling the fabric given in that particular public way that always made him oddly conscious. He set his bag on the overhead shelf with a slow, considered motion. The cabin filled with the small, private rituals of travel, earbuds found, magazines opened, sighs released. He placed his hands on his knees and let the engine's low rhythm make a steady space in his head. A child 2 rows ahead began to sing a nonsense song to itself, a high, bright sound that broke the hush. Marcus listened and felt the edges of his day soften. He often used this moment, when strangers were reduced to small, honest sounds, to breathe. He closed his eyes and let the memory of his mother's voice come, faint and perfect. She had told him once, when he was a boy with too many questions and too few answers, that a man's worth was the quiet of his hands. Marcus had never understood exactly what she meant, but the memory of her voice steadied him. Halfway through the ascent, as the plane climbed into a strip of cloud, Marcus's phone buzzed. He opened it without a start. He had learned to live with interruptions, and read a message that made the airplane's white noise melt into a single new sound, the low, urgent hum of possibility. The message was from an unknown number and contained a single line, "Do you remember the silver watch?" He stared at the text as if it had suddenly become a live thing. The silver watch was a gift from his father, an object with a face like a small moon and a history he had tried to keep tucked under the comfortable blankets of money and success. The watch reminded him of a time before contracts and headlines, when secrets seemed smaller and the world was no larger than the next rooftop. He felt the familiar press of history, of things unresolved that had been waiting patiently for his attention. There was no sender name, no explanation. Just the sentence, bright and plain. Marcus felt something shift in him, an old, raw curiosity waking, the kind that had propelled him out of his childhood room and into boardrooms. The text was a crack in the veneer of convenience that surrounded him. It was an invitation or a provocation, and he did not know which. Outside, the clouds folded like paper. Inside, the plane hummed a steady, indifferent song. Marcus put the phone away and watched a man across the aisle, pale hands, gray sweater, shift in his seat as if reaching for something. Marcus did not think much of it. People moved on planes. People made mistakes. People took seats they thought were empty. He gave himself the small permission to return to the safer, duller thoughts that kept the rest of his night manageable. Contracts to sign, investors to call, the soft, persistent ache of a life that had not yet learned to sleep. But the message waited in his pocket, a small, patient thing. It was impossible in that moment to know whether it would be the beginning of relief or the beginning of a long, ugly turning. He took a breath, slow, even, and for the first time in a while, he let himself feel the thin hum of the unknown. The cabin light was soft, even gray, when Marcus stood and reached for the overhead bin. The plane had settled into its steady, hummed rhythm, and for a few minutes the world narrowed to the warm, recycled air and the small, private acts people perform when they are between places. Marcus lifted his bag and slid it into the space above him, felt the fabric brush his fingers, and then lowered himself back into his seat with the practiced, contained motion of a man who did not like to make a scene. He clicked his seatbelt into place and smoothed the crease at his knee. The message about the silver watch had not left his mind. It sat there in the small dark of his pocket, like a seed. He could have ignored it. He could have let the coded life of his day reclaim him. Instead, he traced the edge of the watch he wore now, the face glinting faintly in the cabin light. It was not the same watch, not really. It was a public thing, polished and guarded. The other was a private history. 2 rows ahead, a man stood in the aisle speaking quietly with the flight attendant. His voice was calm, controlled. Marcus did not listen. He had learned to live inside the swoop of other conversations, but then the man turned and looked into the cabin, and his gaze rested for a second where Marcus had his knees. The man's eyes were not hostile. They were simply measured, the kind of look you give something you are considering like an object on a table. A few moments later, the woman in the seat beside Marcus, an elderly woman with a scarf that smelled faintly of lavender, made a small noise and turned her head. The man, too, rose up, moved down the aisle. He paused at Marcus's row and then, as if by accident, took the seat at the window that had been printed on Marcus's boarding pass. Marcus blinked. The man's hand rested on the armrest as if it had always belonged to him. He smiled, small and correct, and closed his eyes against the plane's motion. For a beat, nothing happened. Then, when things happened in the way of small, precise machines, the attendant came by and spoke in that low, formal voice passengers give to each other to keep the engines of courtesy running. "Sir," she said, tapping the other man's shoulder, "this is row 12, seat A." The man opened his eyes like someone waking from a pleasant dream. He looked at Marcus with a calm that could be a problem, and with the same voice he had used before said, "I'm sorry. I must be in the wrong place." Marcus could have smiled and handed the seat over. He could have moved to whatever small, temporary humility would have kept the sky smooth. He did not. The boarding pass felt hot in his fingers. The man's apology had a rhythm Marcus did not like. It was polite on the surface and thin underneath. The narrator thinks plainly moments when a small thing is simply small. There are other moments when a small thing is a hinge. He said quietly, "That is my seat." The man's eyes sharpened with something like surprise, and then, in a move almost rehearsed, he reached into his briefcase and produced a folded printout. "Seat 12A," he said, spreading it flat on his palm. "Confirmed." Marcus looked at the paper, at the numbers stamped neat and black. He felt a small, cold bloom of irritation, an irritation that was not about a seat, but about the principle of being read as if you were nothing more than a photograph. He reached for the attendant's lanyard and asked to see her handheld device. The attendant's face became the professional mask of someone trained to steer small storms into calm harbors. She tapped the screen, frowned for a fraction of a second, and then said, "It appears Mr. Bennett's seat is 12A. Sir, do you have a boarding pass to show?" The man's smile returned, but now it had a note Marcus did not like. "I do," he said. He held up the paper, as if it were a shield. There must be a mistake. People began to look. The old woman beside Marcus sat up straighter. A child behind them craned its neck. Murmurs threaded through the cabin like loose threads. Marcus felt the familiar, unwanted weight of eyes trying to read him. He kept his voice low, because his life had taught him that loudness made a room smaller and meaner. "I booked this seat months ago," he said. "It's on my pass." The man's voice did not rise. He said as if offering a neutral fact, "Sometimes systems double book. It happens." It happened. The narrator offers without judgment. Systems fail. People make errors. But systems can also be directed to fail. The thought slid through Marcus then, a shadow inside the fold of his mind. The message about the silver watch prickled like a mosquito at the edge of his ear. He could feel the small mechanics of something being set, an arrangement of pieces that, when gathered, would form a shape he could not yet see. "You can take another seat," the man said. His words were measured. "There are other open places. There were other seats." Marcus thought of standing up, of refusing, and leaving his bag and walking into the airport, letting the engines whir and the plane continue without him. He thought of the boy on the rooftop who had once believed the sky was equal to anyone who reached. He thought of Daniel's text, "Come home with answers," and felt the word like a finger tapping on something he had not wanted to open. He set the boarding pass between his fingers and held it up. "That is my seat," he said again. And this time the words had more than the rustle of paper behind them. The man's jaw tightened in a movement almost imperceptible. "Sir, The attendant said, now with a firmness that matched the currency of the cabin, "Please." The man interrupted her. He said, soft and clear, "I have business that requires me to sit by the window. I fly this route frequently." The phrase was polished, prepared. It held the kind of authority that asks for deferment rather than confrontation. At that moment, Marcus understood something else. There was a clarity that could arrive like rain through a skylight. The man was not asking to be kind. He was asking to be obeyed. The cabin's mood shifted. The murmurs became a tide against him. Faces directed at him were gentle but expectant, as if he were performing the natural act of stepping aside. The narrator, now more intimate and tender, recognizes the old, aching pattern in Marcus's chest, the pattern of being asked to be small so the world can remain neat. Marcus's fingers tightened on the pass until paper creased. He could have moved. He could have saved himself a scene. He could have given the white space of the seat to keep the sky calm. But the thing in his pocket about the silver watch made the choice feel less trivial. It was not just a seat. It was a line in a ledger he had not yet read. He stood. His voice, when he spoke, was steady in a way that surprised him. "I am not moving." The man's face lost the practiced calm for a microsecond. People who have only ever been given yes find no harder to hold. The attendant called for a supervisor. Phones came out like small, obedient lights. Somewhere, someone spoke into an earpiece. Marcus felt the cabin compress around him. One small man against a sudden, crowded expectation. The whisper that followed him was thin. "This should be easy. Just move." The whisper had the quiet cruelty of a public that expects obedience. In the chair, Marcus saw not only his own reflection in the window, but the reflection of a narrative older than his life, the script of Who Must Give Way. He felt the silver watch's ghost in his palm and thought, with a fear so clean it felt almost sacred, that perhaps the watch had been a key someone else wanted turned. Outside the plane, the ground stayed flat and indifferent. Inside, the air tightened with a pressure that was not from the altitude. The man across the aisle watched without envy. He tasted the victory before it was won. Marcus felt something cold and bright, anger, yes, but also the clear, furious clarity of someone who had been cornered and would not pretend otherwise. When the supervisor arrived, he carried the neutrality of someone who believed in procedure. He checked names, tapped a screen, conferred with the attendant. Marcus watched the movements like a man watching a clock strike. The plane's engines continued their patient hum, as if the machine could not be interrupted by the small human fireworks. The supervisor looked at the printout, then at Marcus's boarding pass, then back again, and for a moment there was nothing to anchor the truth but the thin paper between them. "Sir," the supervisor said, "finally, we'll need to verify. Please hold for a moment." And in that tiny grid of time, the breaths between the supervisor's words and the stillness that followed, Marcus felt the first real tremor of something larger than an airplane seat. He felt lines beginning to arrange themselves into a pattern that might explain the text about the silver watch, the way the man had smiled, the neatness of the papers. He felt the shape of a trap, perhaps, or a test. He felt very clearly that nothing would remain the same when the truth of this small scene unfolded. The cabin smelled faintly of coffee and warm plastic. When the supervisor stepped away to call the records desk, the plane returned to low murmur, the kind of sound that pretends nothing important has happened. Marcus sat very still and watched Thomas Gray fold his hands on the armrest as if that small square of fabric were a throne. Thomas did not look like a man who made trouble. He looked like a man used to getting what he wanted with very little fuss. Marcus let his eyes travel the length of the aisle. Sarah, the young flight attendant, hovered like someone trying not to choose sides. Her uniform sat neat on her shoulders. Her face, when it came to him, was patient and exhausted, which was often what kindness looked like on people who worked on planes. She offered no more than policy and a tired smile. Richard, the supervisor, kept his tone flat and official. He thanked people for their patience, as if he were wrapping the cabin in a thin paper coat of calm. "You can sit wherever you like, sir," Richard told Thomas, glancing at the printout again. "We'll sort this at the gate." Thomas's smile was easy. "I appreciate that," he said. Then, under his breath, he added to no one in particular, "But it would be best if I kept this seat." Marcus watched Thomas's mouth move. The way it bent into a smile suggested practice. Praxis, the narrator thinks. Habitual moves learn to keep the world pliant. Marcus's mouth tightened almost without his command. He had not expected the fight to be about more than a seat, and yet even seats were stories. Daniel's text sat in Marcus's phone like a hot coal. "Come home with answers." Marcus wanted to call Daniel and ask, "Are you here? Are you the one who sent that text?" He wanted to hear the old friend's voice, to find in it the blueprint for what to do. He did not call. He did not like to make his questions loud. He told himself that he must feel this through before he rang the bell that would let someone else in. Across the aisle, a man 2 rows back, young, restless, kept glancing at Marcus as if trying to read the book face down on his lap. Children in the cabin had stopped their small games and watched the adult drama with the blunt curiosity of those who have not yet learned decorum. Margaret, the elderly woman beside Marcus, touched his forearm lightly. "Do you need me to say something?" she whispered. Her voice had the softness of someone who had lived long enough to want to protect small people from public storms. "No," Marcus said. "I've got it." His voice was steady. The narrator, Kinder now, knows Marcus was saying more than that. He was naming himself. He was, in the smallest possible way, refusing to be made less. Thomas offered a reason, polished and casual. "I have a fragile medical condition. Window seats help me manage my breathing." His words were spare, rehearsed softness. He showed no paper for that claim. He did not have to. People make allowances for bodies. Marcus felt the cabin tilt with sympathy falling on Thomas like rain. Sarah's eyes flicked to Marcus. "Sir," she said, "if that is true, perhaps we could arrange for a different seat closer to the aisle in another row. We can check the manifest for any available options." Thomas shook his head with a soft, polite conviction. "I fly this route a lot. I always sit by the window. It's part of my routine." He looked at Marcus now in a way that suggested recognition without warmth. Marcus felt the first undeniable prickle of something else. Thomas knew him. "How do you know me?" Marcus asked, though he had some small idea. The question was a probe wrapped in calm. Thomas smiled and said, "We've met once before, at an event." He said the words like a stone dropped on glass, small, clear, and likely to send cracks outward. Marcus tried to remember. There had been many events. He could not place the face in the long, celebrity-embarrassed blur of handshakes and applause. Which event? Marcus asked. Thomas's fingers tightened a fraction on the armrest. "A private dinner in the city? Last year." He let the pause lengthen. "Just so. You spoke about investments." The cabin absorbed the detail. Marcus felt a twist of shame. He could not immediately explain. He had stood at many podiums, spoken the polished talk of founders who sell confidence like a product. He had said things and given money and smiled. He had not expected any of that to circle back into an airplane aisle like a net. The narrator takes the softer tone again, leaning into Marcus's private weather. There are memories Marcus has kept folded, rows of small decisions that had once felt like survival. The silver watch dangled from that registry. It belonged to his father. It had been lost, taken, maybe pawned in a bar far from the city. Marcus had never known where it had gone. The message on his phone had changed that absent history into a present thing. "You have been targeted before," Margaret said quietly. "Not to be cruel, but people see what you have and they come." Her voice was plain. She had had too many years to soften the edges of truth. Marcus appreciated Margaret for her bluntness. "I know," he said, "but this feels different." Daniel's face flashed in Marcus's brain, not in a call, but a memory of a last message with a bite in it. Daniel wanted results. That had always been Daniel. He did not like loose threads. Marcus felt a secondary current of thought. Perhaps Daniel had nudged something into motion. Perhaps, the narrator admits, friends sometimes push doors and then stand back to see what falls out. Thomas's eyes, when they rested on Marcus again, were not merely curious. They were pleased. "You've changed since I last saw you," he said. "You look more contained. Very polished." The compliment held the shape of a knife. Marcus could see why Thomas might be annoyed. Wealth polished edges and made them visible. Wealth could feel like a statement of unfairness to someone else. But there was also a possibility that Thomas was acting with intention, an intention beyond irritation. Marcus began to sense a pattern. The man's choice of seat, the precise paper in his hand, the old look of recognition. None of it was random. The narrator, now more clinical, notes that people sometimes stage small wars to see how others respond. They apply pressure to reveal a seam. If that was what Thomas had planned, then the seam would open here. If not, then this was an accident with consequences. The supervisor returned and announced they were waiting for verification. People softened and resumed their private worlds. Phones returned to pockets. The tension did not leave. It sat like a small animal beneath a table, moving in fits and stops. Marcus watched Thomas's hands when no one was looking. The hands were neat, nails clean. They did not tremble. Marcus's own hands were steady because they had been trained to be. Gideon, the narrator thinks, no, Daniel had always said Marcus had steadier hands than most. Marcus rolled that thought over like a coin. When Marcus closed his eyes, a picture arrived unbidden. The rooftop of his childhood, the city like an unfurled map below him. A boy had looked at that map and thought of all the ways he might redraw the world. He had not imagined it would be redrawn by someone else's small, sharp choices. A woman 2 rows ahead cleared her throat and shifted. "This is getting uncomfortable," she said, not unkindly. She had no voice in the business of the seat. She only wanted the plane to become a machine with one purpose again, transport. Marcus breathed and felt the ember of something he had not wanted to name. Curiosity braided with anger. He wondered, private and immediate, what Thomas would do if Marcus refused to move. He wondered what Thomas would do if Marcus pushed back further. The thought felt like a live wire. And then, unbidden, came the fear, the kind that sat in the throat. If this was more than a seat, then what else was at stake? The silver watch in Marcus's memory did not feel like an object now. It felt like a story someone else wanted to finish. Marcus found that thought hard and unclean and oddly thrilling. He straightened in his chair and prepared, in the smallest way, to be watched. The supervisor's phone chimed, and the cabin paused like a breath held too long. A hush curved around those who still watched, curious and small. Marcus watched too, but differently now, less for the paper, more for what the paper might not show. He had the sound of Daniel's last message in his head. Come home with answers. He had believed it was a friend's blunt push. In the next turn of the plot, blunt would become a blade. Thomas Gray's smile tightened while the supervisor spoke into his earpiece. He reached into his briefcase with the same slow, deliberate motion he had used before. And this time he did not produce another pass. He produced a small velvet box and set it on his knees like a man laying down a card. The box opened with the soft click of something kept safe for too long. Inside, nestling on faded cotton, was a silver watch. Marcus's watch, not the polished public piece on his wrist, but the watch he had pictured when the anonymous text arrived, the watch with a scratched face, the one with his father's initials carved on the back in a hand that trembled from years of hard work. For a long second the plane's engines made no sound in Marcus's head at all. The watch was a small, sharp thing, an accusation and an answer sitting in velvet. Thomas's eyes found Marcus's, plain and steady. "I found this a few days ago," he said. His voice was something like soft gravel. "It's been in the hands of people who thought it was a trinket. It's not." The narrator leans in now, not to judge but to name. Objects hold stories. Sometimes those stories are true, and sometimes they are bait. The watch, Marcus's watch, was both. Marcus felt the world tilt, a private pressure building behind his ribs. His father's handwriting, the dented crown, the little chip by the 9 o'clock mark. The watch was a map of a boy's life and a man's mistakes. It was not meant to be public. The watch had gone years ago in a blur of broken doors and paper promises. Marcus had never expected to see it again. "How did you get it?" Marcus asked, and his voice was a thin thing. There was anger, but Under it a shame that looked like surprise, surprise at how tightly memory clung. Thomas's smile was not a smile now. "You don't remember me, Marcus," he said, "but I remember you. I remember the night the watch was taken." He tapped the velvet with one finger. "I've been looking for it. People in this city sell parts of themselves when they're desperate. I bought it back piece by piece." The cabin's murmurs turned into a low, attentive hum. People smelled scandal the way they smell rain. Margaret's hand tightened on Marcus's sleeve. Sarah's mouth formed a question without sound. "You recall only the money, not the people," Thomas said. "You recall public things, interviews, speeches, donations. You don't remember faces that were in the dark when something small and private broke." He let the words hang there, like a thread. Marcus's chest ached with a different sort of knowledge, that family things are sometimes not simply lost. They are taken and reallocated, and people who take them sometimes expect repayment. He had not realized there had been witnesses who remembered. Then Thomas did something Marcus did not expect. He produced a photograph and slid it along his knee until it lay in the narrator's light. It was grainy, taken at night, a smear of faces under street lamps. But in the front, slightly blurred, was a younger Marcus, his father in profile, and a man Marcus had never noticed before, Daniel. Time, the impartial narrator notes, is a neat revealer. People leave traces. Photographs do not lie. They only refuse to explain. The photograph bore Daniel's unmistakable haircut, the same tilt of head Marcus had seen in 1,000 emails. Daniel stood beside Marcus's father, and here the grain caught in the film like a held breath. He held the watch. Marcus's stomach folded. He remembered the night differently. A noise in a kitchen, the clink of a safe's latch, voices that had been lost in the fog of a young man's terror. He had not supposed Daniel would be there. Daniel had been his friend. Daniel had been the one who taught Marcus how to translate charm into contracts. Daniel had been family, in a sense that had always felt like shelter. Thomas's voice was dry. He bought it at one point, or arranged for someone to buy it. You were not in the room when the final exchange happened. The words were not accused of venom. They lodged cold and precise. But he ended up with it, and then it moved. And people keep things when they think they can use them. The narrator, who has watched both sides carefully, says plainly, betrayal rarely arrives with thunder. It arrives with a polite sentence and a folded photograph. The tilt in Marcus's world came from that small, clear evidence. Daniel, the friendship, threaded through the watch as if it had been stitched into an old coat. Marcus held his hands in his lap and felt them tremble. There was a hideous, comic thought that he should have known. Another, darker thought arrived like a fist. Daniel had texted him from an unknown number. Those words, do not let them get comfortable. Come home with answers, read now as less a call of friendship and more a summons. The plea to come home was not for Marcus to seek answers, but for someone else to set a scene. Why? Marcus asked, not certain if he wanted the sentence or its echo. Thomas's mouth was thin. Sometimes people hold things to make other people move. Sometimes they want to see how you will behave under pressure. Sometimes it is about control. He tapped the photograph again. Sometimes it is about leverage. A slow understanding crawled across Marcus like cold water. Daniel had not merely nudged, he had arranged. He had been to the room where men traded objects for favors. He had been in the loop. The text in Marcus's pocket was not a friend's shorthand. It was a signal. It was a small mechanism to push Marcus into motion so other cogs could be observed. The cabin blurred a little at the edges. Faces looked like watercolor. Margaret's whisper came up like a prayer. "Oh, Jonathan." She always called him Jonathan in her head, another name for consolation. Marcus did not answer. He felt raw and exposed. The private grief of a watch turned into public proof. The impartial narrator notes that knowing changes the nature of action. Ignorance protects in its way. Knowledge is a responsibility. Marcus had been asked by the man he trusted to come home. But it was not to come home to friendship. It was to enter a room where he would be watched. He thought of Daniel's hand in the photograph, the way it curled around the watch like a small claim. He thought of the emails, the dinners, the files they had shared. He thought of loyalty as a currency Daniel might have traded. He felt, with a cold clarity that made his tongue numb, that his world had been used as a stage. Thomas folded the photograph and closed the velvet box with a soft, final click of a verdict. "I'm not here to ruin you," he said. "I'm here to return what was taken. But I won't pretend there is nothing else at stake." The twist settles like dust. The man Marcus called friend had not only been present at the theft, he had been part of its circulation. Daniel's text was not a helpful push, but a mechanism, and Thomas, who had seemed an ordinary passenger, was a collector of stories and things, someone who had tracked the watch back through alleys and auctions and phone calls. Now, Marcus's journey was no longer only about refusing to be pushed from a seat. It was about the architecture of intimacy and trust. It was about how favors and friendships could be used like keys. It was about understanding that the past had been rearranged without his knowledge, and that someone he loved had been active in that rearrangement. He felt a betrayal so private it hurt more than the public hum. The flight continued its patient progress through the clouds, and the plane might have still landed in the same city. But Marcus, who had once believed the world could be redrawn by honest hands, now saw lines that had been drawn behind his back. He had come on this trip to answer a text. The answer he had been summoned to find was not only about a watch. It was about the man who had sent the signal and what he had traded to get it back. The plane hummed with a patient insistence, and for a while that sound was the only steady thing Marcus could hold. The photograph and the watch had closed like a trap. The air in the cabin tasted faintly metallic. People returned to their screens and novels, but the small island of witnesses remained taut, each face a little sharper in the periphery of Marcus's attention. He felt the watch's image burn under his skin, a private shape made public. He thought of Daniel, of the easy competence Daniel wore like a uniform. Daniel's texts could be brisk and businesslike, and then in the next breath, intimate. Marcus tried to summon the voice he knew so well, to hear whether there might be a warmth, an apology, anything that could soften the edges. He remembered one of Daniel's old jokes about favors. "You give me a favor, I make sure it's worth something." That line now tasted like metal. When the supervisor returned with a printed manifest clutched like a small treaty, Marcus watched the man's hands for signs of neutrality. The supervisor read names and checked boxes with the air of someone who had seen too many small dramas turn large. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "finally, your boarding pass is valid. We'll need to move Mr. Gray." His voice wanted calm, it wanted resolution. Thomas leaned back in his seat slowly. His expression had a new, thin patience. "I would prefer not to be moved," he said. "I believe there's been an error." Marcus could have felt victory then. He could have sat back and let the supervisor's procedure be the end of it. Instead, he felt the slow creep of something larger, an architecture of plans and small decisions. The watch had been a prompt. Who had set the prompt? For what consequence? These were not questions for a single moment. They were doors. Daniel's number came back to him like an echo. Marcus had once believed that loyalty was a thing you measured in years, in shared silences and investments. Now loyalty felt fragile and negotiable. He had built his life on trust that had been cultivated and curated like a brand. To know that a friend might have traded in those roots made the ground under his feet uncertain. Margaret squeezed his hand, a small, grounding thing. "You look pale," she said. Her voice had the practical worry of someone who had known too many storms. "Do you want me to call someone?" "No," Marcus said. He did not want the plane to become a battleground. He did not want Margaret or Sarah to be pulled into a private war. He wanted, with that fierce privacy that had kept him afloat for years, to manage the erosion himself. But the truth pressed, the erosion was not merely his to manage. The photograph had opened a ledger where favors were written like debts. When the plane briefly dipped, a small, competent movement, the fluorescent lights flashed, and for an instant everything looked raw, edges sharpened by motion. Marcus felt the motion like a vestibule of his nerves. He could step back and let the world proceed, letting Thomas keep the seat and saving the dignity of a flight that would remain, after all, only a transit. Or he could make this the moment where he refused to be reshaped by someone else's quiet design. The choices were not dramatic on their face. They were quiet and precise. Give up and keep the peace, or keep the seat and invite escalation. Each choice would ripple. Each choice would send a signal. People were watching, not only Thomas, but the cabin, and beyond them, the networks and the dinners and the small reputations that made up Marcus's world. He thought of his father's hands, how they had held screws and small engines and clocks with the same careful fingers that had once wound the silver watch. His father's hands had taught him the meaning of things, that small parts mattered, that timekeeping was a craft and an ethic. The watch was a small witness to life. To see it presented as a bargaining chip made something inside Marcus clench. He reached for his phone and thumbed Daniel's name without pressing a call. The screen showed only the quiet archive of conversations, dates, times, sentences that had once been ordinary. He remembered Daniel's face in the photograph, the way the light had caught his cheekbone. He wondered if Daniel had thought this would be tidy, a controlled experiment in loyalty and reaction. Or had Daniel been manipulated by someone else with a longer reach? Thomas watched him with the sort of attention practice people give to a chessboard. He was patient and poised, eyes tracking Marcus's small movements like a man reading a file. "You could handle this in a civil way," Thomas said softly. "I understand the sentimental value, but public scenes rarely help anyone." The words were a test and a tactic. Marcus felt the little mirror of his former life, slick diplomatic maneuvers, half smiles in rooms with chandeliers. He felt the old skill of negotiation awaken. How to parry, how to soften, how to extract clarity without burning bridges. He could do that now. He had spent years learning it. But the watch complicated everything. It was no longer only sentiment. It was evidence that the world he had trusted had rearranged pieces without his consent. If he let Thomas keep the window, he wondered what else he might be asked to allow. If he conceded, would the photograph dissolve into gossip, and then into another favor traded in the private markets where reputations were currencies? A child 2 rows forward laughed at a joke someone told, a bright, bare sound that pierced the tension with a reminder of the ordinary. Marcus clung to that smallness, the laugh, and for a moment the world unspooled into simpler measures. Breath, heartbeat, the plane's slow, faithful glide. He also weighed the cost of escalation. Airlines could remove passengers. Security could be called. A confrontation could become news. And news could be loud and unforgiving. Marcus imagined articles with his photograph and a headline about temper and privilege. He imagined Daniel's name surfacing in the comments, people piecing together the photograph like detectives at a slow hour. The thought of public scrutiny made his stomach roll with a cold nausea. He had spent his life performing a curated invisibility, and to become a spectacle felt like a violation. But something else unfurled, less strategic and more raw. Anger, not performative but genuine, warmed him. It was not simply for the watch or the seat. It was for the principle of being used. It was for the idea that a man who once called himself a friend had possibly orchestrated a small humiliation to see what it would fetch. In the small, insulated world of the cabin, Marcus made a decision that had nothing to do with optics. He would not be a passive variable. He would not prove someone else's point by shrinking. He would insist on the truth. Whether that meant a scene or a quiet resolution, he could not tell. He only knew that his hands, which had been taught to steady, could not fold now without leaving a rip in something deeper. He rose again, this time with the clarity of someone placing a marker on a map. People turned. The supervisor put up a hand as if to shield the normal order, but Marcus moved past the reflex of fear. He felt, under the swell of anxiety, the beginning of a steadier current, a resolve that would not allow old bargains to be made on his back. As he spoke, his voice was low but clear. He would say what needed to be said. He would ask what had been done. He would seek the names behind the photograph. He would ask Daniel directly, if necessary. The plane continued to hum, indifferent yet full of potential. The tension tightened, thread by thread, until it made a wire. The decision to hold fast did not end the story. It merely changed its direction, and the new path bent toward questions Marcus had been avoiding. Who betrayed him? Why? And how far would those betrayals reach? The cabin light had the thin gold of late afternoon when the moment snapped open. Outside, the sky was a flat, honest blue. Inside, everything felt smaller and louder. Marcus stood in the aisle as if the plane itself were a stage and everyone its audience. The supervisor had called for the captain. The captain, in the low, businesslike comm pilot's own, promised they would not taxi until this was resolved. That delay turned the cabin into a room where truths could no longer hide behind motion. Thomas Gray watched Marcus with the same patient attention he had used all along, as if he were reading a verdict before it was written. The velvet box lay closed in Thomas's lap like a secret with weight. Phones lit faces into small screens of expectation. Sarah hovered, hands folded, the flight attendant's training making her careful and human at once. Margaret's breathing was thin but steady at Marcus's side. Richard kept his professional face, but his eyes betrayed curiosity. The narrator leans close to Marcus now, soft and intimate. He felt the bitterness of a life rearranged, but he also felt a sharp, surprising clarity. Anger had been a raw fuel, and now that it burned, it made him see edges more cleanly. He wanted names. He wanted reasons. He wanted to step into daylight and show the photograph and watch the lie fall away. Daniel's name hovered in Marcus's throat like a stone he could not swallow. He stepped into the aisle and, with a voice that was both tired and edged, said, "Daniel, pick up." It was a small theater of demand, but then Daniel's phone improbably rang. The number displayed a name Marcus had loved, Daniel Hart. The plane's small speaker made the voice thin. Daniel answered, and it was like opening a wound and expecting to find a map. "Marcus?" Daniel's voice came through, careful and small. "Is everything?" Marcus did not let him finish. He felt the room lean toward the wire of his words. "Did you send the text about the silver watch?" There was a pause long enough to see the way people held their breath. The narrator, impartial now, notes that a pause often carries a truth heavier than any sentence. Daniel's voice arrived, steadier but with a crack. "I did. I thought." "Thought what?" Marcus asked. He could feel his pulse in his jaw. "That you could make me move? That you could make me prove something to you?" Daniel took a breath that trembled. "I needed you to come home, Marcus. There are things, old agreements, that need looking at. I never thought it would be on a plane. I never wanted you humiliated." Thomas's mouth was a thin line. The impartial voice notes a small detail. Many betrayals begin with a soft excuse. They come wrapped in the language of necessity. "You used me," Marcus said. The words were simple and heavy. "You arranged it. You were in the photograph with the watch. You knew." There was a long breath. Daniel's voice slid, lower, almost ashamed. "I was there. I took the watch once, Marcus. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I controlled it, I could keep it from others who would use it against us. I didn't see how it would be used to pull you into a corner. I didn't know Thomas would." The sentence fractured. Thomas's face was impassive, but his fingers tightened on the velvet box. The narrative, kinder now, understands human error and the way protective acts can turn into possession. Daniel, who had once been a friend, had crossed a line where help became ownership. "Protecting me?" Marcus laughed, a sound that had no joy. "You bought my history. You turned it into currency. You sent a signal that would hum in my pocket and call me home so someone else could play puppeteer. How is that protection?" Daniel's answer came small and raw. "It was not meant to be like this. There are people, old, money, people who remember what your father's company was, who wanted leverage. I thought if I could keep the watch away from them, I could keep whatever they wanted away from you. I made arrangements. I made mistakes." The impartial narrator notes the thin logic of fear. It breeds secrecy, and secrecy invites trade. Daniel's fear had been a currency he used until it bankrupted him morally. Thomas, the collector, had been a buyer, or perhaps a cleaner of what others left behind. "You set me up to be observed," Marcus said. "You let others test me." Daniel's voice broke. "I thought I could control it. I thought, Marcus, I wanted to keep you safe, and I misjudged everything. I am sorry." The cabin watched the confession like a slow curtain drop. People's faces lost the curiosity of spectators and took on the more complicated expression of witnesses. Margaret's hand tightened and then loosened on Marcus's sleeve. Her loyalty was to small truths, not to headlines. Sarah's eyes were damp but professional. She had seen private things spill into public spaces before. Thomas finally spoke, his voice dry as paper. "Mr. Bennett, this does not absolve the way people hoard memory and trade it. I returned the watch because I thought reconciliation was possible, or at least clarity. I did not set out to harm you. I wanted to prove a point, how people behave when shown what they have lost. You wanted to prove a point?" Marcus repeated. He felt the words land like a physical thing, heavy and hurtful. The narrator, now more reflective, names the truth. People who want proof often create trauma to measure reaction. They forget the people under the experiment. Outside, the plane waited. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and neutral. "We'll be delayed on the ground until this is resolved." The statement was bureaucratic, but it was also a promise of time Marcus now used to ask more questions. He asked Daniel, "Who else knows? Who else arranged this?" Daniel hesitated. "There were others," he said finally. "Men with stakes in old factories, men who remembered favors owed. I thought I could keep it from getting too big. I failed." Marcus could feel the world of his childhood, the lost workshops, the small dignities of his father, shifting into the room like people returning to claim rent. Betrayal, Marcus realized, was not only about treachery. It was about the attempt to shield that became a theft. He closed his eyes and breathed, listening to the hum of the cabin and to the thin sound of his own breath, which now felt like a drum calling him back to himself. He could call security, press charges, make the story a public unmakings of a friend. He could, alternatively, hold the photograph like a ledger and measure each kindness against each harm and decide what to keep. The narrator grows tender now. Marcus, standing at the center of this small storm, felt old responsibilities and new clarity collide. He thought of his father's hands and of the boy on a rooftop who had once believed he could redraw a map. He thought of Daniel's voice and of the small human failings that masqueraded as strategy. He thought, really for the first time in a long while, about what he actually wanted. He chose a third path, not oblivion and not vengeance, but a hard, slow reclamation. He would not make Daniel the public villain in an immediate, televised spectacle. He would demand truth and accountability. Yes, he would also demand repair in a way that could not be bought with apologies. He asked Daniel to meet him after landing at a place where words could be longer than a phone call and where witnesses would not be in aircraft cabins curious strangers. Daniel agreed, voice small and relieved. Thomas closed the velvet box and handed it to Marcus with both hands, a gesture that was not an apology, but an offering. Marcus took it. The watch's metal was cool and honest in his palm, and in that small weight, he felt the years and the cost. He let the watch rest there, the initials on the back catching the light like a small confession. When the plane finally taxied away, it was with a quiet that felt almost respectful. The public had been given some closure. The private had more work to do. Marcus sat down and looked out the window as the runway unrolled. He did not yet know how he would rebuild the lines that had been drawn without his consent. He only knew he would no longer be moved by anonymous signals, nor by friends who thought ownership a form of protection. The final voice, gentle and honest, offers a thought. The most powerful acts are not always dramatic. They are the ones that return what was taken, ask hard questions, and demand repair. Marcus had chosen to gather truth, not to scatter blame for show. The plane rose, and with it a man who had been tested and in some small way had learned to set the terms of his own life again. The airport felt different on the ground, too bright, too ordinary after the cramped gravity of the cabin. People moved with the small, practical efficiency of those who must continue when a moment has passed. Marcus walked out of the plane, cradling the silver watch like a fragile thing, and the world felt both lighter and heavier at once. Light because something private had been returned. heavy because the truth had widened into places he had not expected. Outside the terminal, the air smelled of hot pavement and diesel. Daniel waited by the curb, hands in his coat pockets, face shaded by guilt and something like relief. He looked smaller than Marcus remembered, not because he had lost stature, but because the shape of what he had done had been revealed and it fit him oddly. Thomas stood a little apart, watching with a patience that had less to do with restraint now and more with the knowledge of what had been set in motion. They sat in a small cafe near the terminal, the sound of luggage wheels passing like a steady metronome. Marcus felt the watch heavy in his palm. It carried the heat of his father's life and the cold proof that private things can be used as tools. He set it on the table between them as if laying down an old, dangerous animal. Daniel began to speak, halting and plain. He said he had acted out of fear. Fear of the men who had come knocking about old debts, fear of what might happen if pieces of Marcus's past circulated in rooms he never saw. He tried to explain the logic that had felt like protection to him. Take control of the thing that could hurt. Hide it, watch it. He admitted he had misjudged the moral cost. He said he had thought keeping the watch meant keeping Marcus safe. Marcus listened without interrupting. He felt the slow, practical work of anger settling into something else, the paint of disappointment drying into a hard line. He asked direct questions. Who else knew? Who arranged the watch's circulation? What had been traded for it? Daniel answered as best he could. He named a few people who had exchanged favors and favors owed, men who kept old records and older grudges. The names mattered less than the pattern. Secrecy, barter, the hiding of harm behind intentions named as protection. Thomas spoke then, quietly. He had not wanted to hurt Marcus, he said. He had wanted to return what was lost, but he had also wanted to test the weight of memory. He described how he had tracked the watch through markets and backrooms, how he had waited to see who would show up for it. That honesty cost him something, too. Marcus could see that. Thomas's patience had been a strategy. It had been cruel, but not without a human need at its root to make the private public and watch for truth. I wanted to know who would stand for what was theirs, Thomas said. I thought the smallest spark would tell me everything. And it did, Marcus said. His voice was not loud. It was like the sound of a tool closing in place, but not the way you wanted. They spoke for a long time. They spoke about the watch and about the photograph and about how a friendship could be folded into a ledger. Daniel's remorse was real enough that he volunteered to help Marcus untangle the old debts and the men who traded favors for influence. He promised to put names and records on a table to make the hidden transactions visible. Marcus did not accept this as absolution. He accepted it as a starting point. When he thought about what to do next, Marcus felt an old impulse to fix what had broken. He could have used the watch as a talisman of victory or as a weapon to publicize Daniel's betrayal. He could have called the press, made a spectacle, and watched reputations fall like dominoes. That would have been the loud option. It would have felt clean for a moment and hollow afterward. Instead, Marcus chose a quieter, more difficult path. He asked Daniel to join him in confronting the men who had kept the ledger of favors, those who thought of reputation and history as things to be bought. He asked for full disclosure for public accounting where it was due and private reparations where money could not heal the harm. He told Daniel that repair must be earned, not purchased. Daniel agreed, with a face that did not try to look lighter than his deeds. Marcus also spoke to Thomas. He told him that some tests leave scars that do not wash easily. But he also said something gentler, that Thomas's return of the watch, however tangled, had given Marcus an opportunity. I will not pretend this didn't hurt, he told Thomas. But if you are willing to help unwedge the people who think memory is currency, I will work with you. That offer surprised Thomas, who had arrived expecting perhaps a public denouncement. He accepted with a slow, guarded nod. The work ahead would be long and unspectacular. It would involve lawyers and lists and late nights of reading old ledgers and making calls. It would involve meeting people Marcus once admired and asking them to explain why they had traded pieces of his life as if they were spare parts. In the months that followed, the private work closed like a book. There were apologies, some heartfelt, some embarrassed, and a few relationships that could not be mended. Daniel stepped back and stepped forward in equal measure. He faced uncomfortable conversations and, slowly, started to make amends. He helped Marcus unravel a small web of favors that had been used to pressure families and businesses. Some men paid fines or issued public statements. Others did not. Marcus started a small foundation in his father's name. It was not a publicity engine. It was a practical thing: legal clinics for people whose small belongings had been taken as leverage, workshops on how to protect personal histories, and a digital archive where artifacts could be recorded without being turned into bargaining chips. He used the watch as a symbol in one small, private way, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of why he had to act differently. The foundation hired researchers and lawyers and ordinary people who had been hurt by similar trades. It was slow. It was stubborn. At night, Marcus would wind the watch and feel its small tick. The sound was quiet, steady. It reminded him of his father's hands and also of the complexity of human motives. He sometimes thought of Daniel, their friendship altered but not wholly destroyed, and of how fear can make people do things they later regret. He thought of Thomas, who had been both tester and restorer, and of the odd ways people seek truth. There was no neat, moral closure that made everything right. Some things, once bent, could not be reshaped. But there was repair where repair could be done, and that counted for something. Marcus learned that power must be matched with care, that protection can become possession if held too tightly, and that truth often arrives messy and costly. In a quiet moment, months later, Marcus sat on a rooftop like the boy he had once been. The city spread below him, lights like a scattered constellation. He turned the watch in his fingers and thought about time, the way it records, the way it is kept, and the way it can be stolen. He thought about promises and their weight. He thought about the cost of small betrayals and the harder work of rebuilding trust. He did not know if his father would have approved of his choice to make things public in one way and private in another. He imagined his father's hands, patient and exact, and felt a small smile. The watch ticked. The night breathed. Marcus felt, at last, a steadying that was not the shape of victory, but the shape of work done rightly. The narrator, two voices now blending, one close and understanding, the other steady and clear, offers what the ending shows. Truth can be slow. Repair can be quieter than revenge. And a man's worth can be measured not by how he is protected, but by how he protects what is not his to own. Marcus carried the watch, not as proof of pain, but as a reminder to keep the small things whole. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.